And
Okay. Are we back? Give us a message if we are back. Sorry about that. We've got you know, the capitalist broadband problems like we sometimes do. But do give us a little message if we're back on. That would be very reassuring from our point of view. If anyone can see that. But yeah, and give us a share and give us a like. Oh, I think we've got a message there. I think we might be back on. So let's just check this. Yeah, we are back. So can people do us a favor and like this one and give it a share so that all the people that were on before can come back and tell us where we were up to. Yeah, it is probably Keir Starmer messing with the broadband. You are all absolutely correct about that. You've correctly identified what the issue is. We were talking about a centrist in Keir Starmer, and we've all swapped positions on the screen as well, which is super fun. So we were up to speaking about, I believe, Emmanuel Macron and where his support is coming from. It's shifted. So previously, Conservative voters have sort of like that kind of tradition, have probably switched their allegiance to Macron. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, Macron or Le Pen, they've gone both ways. That the sort of the electorate that would have once gone behind the centre-right Conservative Party equivalent, some of them really, xenophobia is their big concern, and some of them are sort of certain middle-class respectability is their big concern.
Mm.
So based on those priorities, they've gone.
I heard from taking a lot of the Conservative Party of France votes. It wasn't Le Pen who was taking the centre-right votes, it was Zemmour. And so, of course, now Zemmour has endorsed Le Pen. So I always thought it was going to be Le Pen and Zemmour taking votes off each other, but it was actually Zemmour was bypassing Le Pen. But of course, now he's swung his support behind her. Zemmour only got how many votes?
7 point something percent.
Yeah, 7.07%.
So, right, Harry, was there anything else on that graphic that you wanted to bring up?
Not on the first slide, which just shows the voter breakdown. I've got a few other graphs about age, age and professions. If that comes up in conversation, we'll get to that, but I don't have to for the moment.
Okay, that's absolutely great. Right, so what's the next phase then? So the left have kind of entirely missed out. We've got the worst possible scenario that we could have for the left, where we've got a centrist who actually seems to be speaking the language of the right in a lot of cases. Is that correct? Have I misunderstood this, or is it true that Marie Le Pen actually looked shocked at something that was it Macron or one of his ministers said about Muslims?
Yeah, so Macron pitches himself as the centre and taking the best ideas from the right and the left. And for people who aren't very political, that sounds like a very attractive proposition. And he did a big breakthrough in 2017 on that basis. And the Conservative Party in the UK does very well by saying, we're not interested in politics, nor are you, just vote for us. Those of us who are slightly more political anoraks, we know that centrism is a bit intellectually unsatisfactory. How can you be 50% left and 50% right? How can you mix your water and your wine? And indeed, Macron has been governing from the right in economic policy and indeed in his rhetoric somewhat towards migrants, but especially towards France's existing Muslim population. And I found that quite striking because his big pitch in 2017 was, at least I'm not the far right. And it turns out he is a little bit the far right. Now, in
But
any government anywhere in the world, the position of Minister of the Interior or Home Secretary, watering your wine a little bit too much, it seems you've become soft on the question of Islam. And she was genuinely speechless. And for once in her life, I can sympathize. So Macron's been playing to the far right. I like a lot the phrase that Stanley used, the extreme centre. I think that's a correct way to term Macron and his political ilk in other countries. And if I'd voted for Macron in the first round 5 years ago to stop the far right, I'd be a very dissatisfied consumer by now.
I think it's important as well for to explain the role of religion or lack of religion in French public life as well, and why I think sometimes there's just downright racism in French public life, and also because in 1902 they voted to separate the church and state completely. Although there are some cases in the east of France where the French state still does give subsidies to religious schools, Catholic religious schools. But generally, so I work in the state schools in France. And so, for example, you're not allowed to wear a cross. You're not really allowed to talk about religion unless it's from a class point of view. And there's a lot of young Muslim girls who are not allowed to wear their religious clothing in their classrooms. So this law going back to 1902 and the way it influences French politics today about religiously practicing Muslims, it infiltrates down to every part of French society. And it goes down to even to the youngest of 5 years of age. This sort of notion of religion is not meant to be in French society, unless you're a white Catholic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that you weren't allowed to wear a cross. I knew there was certain things about. I saw a few things a few years ago about people getting really upset about people wearing bikinis. And I remember my dad's an Irish Catholic, and I remember my dad's joke was, I think he'd probably, I think the world would probably prefer if I wore a bikini at the beach. You know, these would be like nice and covered up. Do you know what I mean? So, like, what was all that about? What was that, like, caring so much about what people wore at the beach?
Yeah, so as Stanley says, there's sort of historic laws in France separating church and state. And that was born out of struggles in the 19th century between the Catholic Church and secular politicians. Secular meaning perhaps the individuals were non-practicing, but believing there should be a separation between religious structures and political structures. So not necessarily atheistic, but secular.
Religion is the personal and it's private.
Yeah, but those laws and that body of thought was really born out of a political struggle with the Catholic Church, which was the creed of the majority of French people, a powerful political player. So it's a really particular historical context that sort of maybe faded into the background in the middle of the 20th century because religious practice was declining, and there was a sort of degree of consensus after the Second World War about what France's political institutions should look like. We can nuance that, but yeah, as far as the role of religion, at least. But then in the 21st century, these laws have been reanimated and repurposed to turn their fire on Muslims and to pass new laws to go further and further and further in prescribing what and where Muslims can wear things that are associated with their faith. So I think Stanley would probably agree, it's not just a continuity in culture, attitudes and laws from the beginning of the 20th century. It's been very much whipped up and revived to feed a very contemporary Islamophobia. And what's particular about this is that the left, some parts of the left, have really gotten on board with this because it's been able to be framed in terms of a separation of church and state and neutrality between all religions, rather than just bashing a particular minority. And finally, with regards to the burkini, Paul mentioned, B-U-R, burkini, so beachwear designed to cover nearly all parts of the body for the sake of modesty. Some people argued, because this was being worn for religious reasons, that it was a religious symbol being worn in a public place and therefore violated secular laws. So you had policemen on the beach in the south of France, going up to Muslim women, enjoying the sunshine in the clothing they wanted to wear, and harassing them and handing out fines.
So to sort of bring it all back, like there's this really like deep, ingrained anti-religiousness in French politics. Not anti-religion, anti-Muslim, practicing Islam, and so like Macron and Le Pen are really sort of Macron's really trying to play the soft card on this, but of course still appeal to sort of like the soft left of French politics. Well, he especially did in 2017, and as we've said in 2022, he's really shown his colours in terms of the economy.
Yeah.
So
because electorally it's quite interesting. Macron, so as we said, French politics is a runoff system, and for a long time your dream was to be in a runoff with the far right, because traditionally in the runoff everyone votes against the far right. So they'll say no, we can't have, and so even if the far right, have got a solid block, a quarter, a third of people who want to vote for them, everyone will vote against them. So that was Macron's plan and dream, both this election, the last time round, being a runoff with the far right. So when it's the election, Macron is playing to his liberal credentials, saying Le Pen is racist, Le Pen is dangerous, we're against that. And that was reflected in a very liberal electorate for Macron 5 years ago. Once he was actually in government, he played a completely different strategy and tried to enlarge his political coalition to take parliamentarians and voters from the right. It seemed successfully. And in government, he definitely played an anti-Muslim rhetoric, and he will find out whether he's able to backpedal from that enough in this election or not.
So, like, tomorrow, do we find out who will be the president of France?
Yes.
That was my best Philomena Kunk there. Like, and does he get a magical scepter? No, we've got one of those in the UK, haven't we? A magical scepter that allows us to do politics in the Houses of Parliament. But anyway, so tomorrow is the big runoff. It's going to happen. Where do we think the votes are going to go? Is this on a knife edge? Do we think the left will be apathetic and say, actually, I don't want to vote for either of these candidates? There was someone who mentioned in the comments before, I can't access them now because when we went off and came back on, but someone in the comments before said that they'd heard about someone on the left saying they were going to vote for Le Pen to keep Macron out. So we've got this very, very strange situation that I don't understand. So where do we think these votes are going to go from? There's a very large left-wing bloc there. There's a large enough left-wing bloc that could have got a left-wing candidate on there if we looked at what the graphic said earlier on. Where are those votes going to end up, do we think?
I think Macron's going to edge it out. I think there is that, as you highlighted, there are some left-wing people who are going to vote for Le Pen. But the thing is, it's really unsure. It really is that much knife, because Macron's got about 55% in the polls at the moment, and Le Pen's got the rest, of course. But there's also a lot of apolitical, unknown voters in the millions, and so they could really influence the vote if they decide to turn out. Because, like we were saying before,
these people who didn't vote in these primaries,
well, or people who are not sure who they're going to vote for, Le Pen or Macron.
Yeah, they have no strong feelings about those, or they do have strong feelings about both of those candidates, and it's like, which one is the least bad? I guess we're back to that again.
I do not know, because obviously they're the silent. I would assume they're the silent group of politics.
Yeah, I think the activists behind Mélenchon, next to none of them are going to be voting for Le Pen because they see her as the far right, and she is the far right. And when it came to endorsing candidates in the runoff, Mélenchon had a particular line of saying not one vote for the far right. And that was his way of saying, I'm not neutral between these two candidates, but nor am I positively endorsing Emmanuel Macron. But, don't do one vote for the far right. And there's a question of strategy as well, because a lot of his voters will not vote for Macron, regardless of what Mélenchon says. So is Mélenchon going to say something that could lose those people from the political coalition? There's a legitimate, to my eyes, legitimate strategic question there. In terms of the wider electorate for Mélenchon, polling shows they're going to split roughly three ways, with a large third voting Macron, no doubt out of disgust, a large third not voting at all, but in some cases consciously deciding not to vote at all or to spoil their ballot, and then a small third, a bit less than a third now, I think, perhaps nearer to 20%, who will vote for Le Pen. I'm in a lot of Facebook groups, social media groups supporting Jean-Luc, and it's interesting seeing the discussions there. There's no activists advocating or saying that they will vote for Le Pen. There's a few people who voted for Mélenchon and are disgusted with Macron, who they see as sort of a suited, well-heeled president of the rich. And so for them, Marine Le Pen is the more working class candidate, which she isn't in terms of her personal biography. In terms of her electorate, she is. And there's also a very interesting comment of someone saying, I'll get to that comment in a second. I think there's lots of people spoiling their ballot or not voting out of disgust. A lot of people voted Macron last time to stop Le Pen, but to their eyes, it's a deliberate setup. Macron and his supporters in the media want it to be a runoff with the far right. And they're saying, okay, well, we don't want to, be puppets in this game where the far right and the extreme centre are the best of enemies. They love being in a runoff with each other. And the extreme centre, when in government, only moves further and further to the right. So a lot of people will be spoiling their ballots. Finally, what was very interesting was someone saying, an ordinary voter, not an activist, saying that she was disgusted by everything that Le Pen stood for, that she was a hospital worker and she wanted to be allowed to go back to work in the hospital again without being vaccinated. Whereas under Macron, this is not possible. Whereas Le Pen, like Mélenchon, has opposed some of the more drastic aspects, draconian aspects of Macron's management of COVID. So I think lots of people are focusing in on individual policies, be it the retirement age, be it the management of COVID, be it some moderately redistributive things in Le Pen's programme, may vote Le Pen for that reason. Whereas those who take a step back and are concerned about the xenophobic aspects of it probably won't.
There's something I want to pick up on there about when you were talking about vaccinations. I've noticed lately that the most authoritarian people on vaccinations appear to be this extreme centre that we're talking about. So the centrists are they seem much more keen on putting in rules where people have to be vaccinated and things like that. Much more keen than both the left and the right. Now, within the left, there are people who believe that there should be mandatory vaccinations, and within the right, there are. But there seems to be a lot more consensus in the extreme centre, and a lot less understanding of people saying, actually, no, I'm not quite sure about this. When I want to talk about this, I want to, there can be no discussion around that. Is that something that is going to play? Is this going to play a role in this runoff? Then, in that case, if the nurse was saying that she wanted to go back to work without being vaccinated.
Well, I'd just like to talk about I've lived through two lockdowns now in France, and they were very, very strict compared to Britain in what we could do, and Macron very much upset the beehive when he made the pass vaccinal, or pass sanitaire, sorry, pass vaccinal come after, when he made it mandatory to show your barcode from your vaccine pass to even enter a cafe or a restaurant or a movie theatre. And so I think the French are very based on their values of liberty, and so he very much angered a large group of people. And there are very much, I've met people last summer, traditionally left people, who were very angry and alienated by this coercive behavior of centrist government. So I was working on farms last summer, and you would think, and normally when you work on the organic farms, that you would meet more open-minded left-wing people. But a lot of these people who I met who were very left-wing were also very anti-COVID, anti-pass sanitaire. And so I feel that will be a big factor in this. Just across French society, whoever you spoke to, you would meet people who are very angered by this pass sanitaire, health pass. Sorry.
Yeah. Was there no debate in front? Because one of the things that I think about all of this is the people who are worried about the authoritarian aspect of what's going on with vaccine passes and so on. It's simply because there's no debate. You aren't allowed to say, actually, can we weigh up the pros and cons of whether this vaccine is safe? No, it's safe. It's safe. I have to do that. And they say, well, can we not talk about it? And that debate really hasn't been had publicly. Certainly not in the UK, as far as I'm concerned. They just had a lot of people from Pfizer and a lot of people from the government saying, yes, it is safe. Take the vaccine. This is going to be great. And then when anyone came up with anything else and said, well, and then Pfizer were going to bury the documentation for 75 years and all sorts of quite worrying things that I think it's perfectly legitimate to be worried about. That's not to say it's a bad idea to have a vaccine. That's just, it's perfectly normal to have a question and have a real debate. Has that debate been had in France, or is it just the same as I've just described there, like where people have just said, no, this is safe, this is fine, there is no problem here, shut up, go away, we don't want to talk about this?
You're right. The idea of an extreme centre that both of you has used is quite instructive, because central to a lot of centrist politics is that politics doesn't really exist. Being left-wing or right-wing, these are just two different forms of extremes, two different ways you can be a bit excessive or over the top. So politics is actually just about being common sense and centrist. And so then when you apply that to actual political management, it's pretended that, okay, the aim of a centrist in government is to pursue what any reasonable person will agree is common sense against the naysayers, the conspiracy theorists, the extremists. Now, with COVID at the beginning, we were dealing with a big unknown, a virus we didn't know how it worked. So that was a time for blunt measures, big lockdowns, wait and see, wait for the research to come in. But then there came to be a point where we had to have a societal discussion. It was, okay, what's the trade-off between lockdowns and health? What forms of lockdown work? We're locking down forms of social life, but not all forms of professional working life. The vaccines, as far as I can tell, having the two vaccines makes a huge difference to the collective immunity of a population. The third vaccine doesn't seem to extend immunity from serious symptoms that much longer. So perhaps we should have a discussion about whether blanket third vaccine programs are legitimate or not. These are all political discussions we need to start having about the way we live, about how we enforce public health measures, about how we build consensus. And people who have a sort of centrist or extreme centrist view, saying that politics is just common sense, and anyone who goes against the common sense is a conspiracy theorist or an extremist, they're not open to discussions like that, because discussions like that for them shouldn't exist. So hence the very authoritarian measures we've seen, certainly to a great degree in the UK, but I think especially in France, and there's a big blowback against that. And Le Pen's probably in quite a favoured position to benefit from that electorally.
Yeah, you definitely. It was often you would hear about a president. Often you'd be doing your thing in the day, and then you would hear the announcement tonight. Look, Macron is talking tonight, or Jean Castex, the current Prime Minister of France. You would hear of the announcement, and then they would just come out with this new policy, and that was it. And I forget now, it was in July, and they gave us I think it was as little as 4 weeks to get a vaccine pass, to get evidence of our first jab before you could get your first jab and the barcode, or I've had COVID within the last 4 or 6 months. And then suddenly there was this societal transformation where I think also like Macron played on this confusion about what it meant for a pass sanitaire, health pass, what it meant for society. And whilst a lot of people were discussing this, Macron introduced it. So he sort of introduced the policy, and then there was the debate afterwards. And I do know that he was forced to change 1 or 2 things about the pass sanitaire, but I can't quite remember them exactly at the moment.
So it sounds like in a lot of ways it was possibly even more extreme than we had in the UK, which was actually pretty extreme from certain points of view, and certainly like the way the vaccine went out and everyone had to, go along with this, and you weren't allowed to question it. I think that's most of the people I hear complaining about this, saying we weren't allowed to question anything. We weren't allowed to find out about anything. It was simply, this is fine, and if you say anything other than this, then that makes you an anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorist, nut job. And then that forced people towards that position where they're like, well, actually, if I'm going to be called a nut job, I might as well, own that. Possibly a very, very counterproductive strategy. So let's look into the future. If Macron wins, what happens?
This is a tough question because it's sort of like there's no victory tomorrow. Like we can maybe say that Macron's slightly less bad than Le Pen, but no matter who wins, it would feel like a defeat. The French left is disgusted with Macron, and so seeing his smiling face appear on the television as the winner is going to make lots of people a bit nauseous. In June, there are parliamentary elections in France. So the president has his power balanced quite marginally by the French parliament. And so Mélenchon's line on the left has been, this is the third round of the election. So the runoff is the second round, there's a third round. So it will be a big test to see if the left can stay together and add their forces perhaps even more so than at the moment for the parliamentary election beyond. So far, they haven't been able to do that. They've been like cicadas that appear at a presidential election with Mélenchon and then disappear underground again for all of the elections in between, for local government, for parliament, when it's the old traditional parties who hoover up most of the votes. So that'll be interesting to see. Stanley said earlier that some French leftists are resentful that Mélenchon has been around for so long and is still the figurehead of things.
Not resentful, frustrated.
Frustrated, okay. I think this is almost certainly his last presidential election. So the big question is, can it survive beyond him? And yes, on the one hand, you can make that criticism. Why haven't you made space for someone else? I personally do think he's very adept. And in Britain, we're maybe too far the other way of chucking people out the window once they fail once. But it's actually a serious question for many of us thinking about how do we do radical left politics, is can we do it without a great big figurehead at the top? And our temptation is always to say, yes, we can. It's got to start at the grassroots, build up from the bottom upwards. I'm not sure if that's what the empirical evidence shows. I sort of suspect the answer is we need the two together. We need articulate activists at every level of our organization, but it certainly helps to have someone at the top who goes in the media, who wins the battle every time, who's amusing, who's smart, who's funny, engages with people who get their politics by listening to the radio, watching the television, but who aren't linked up with activists yet. And I do think in Britain we lack a Nigel Farage of the left. And Mélenchon was the Nigel Farage on the left of being a very well-known personality on the left. So now we'll see the difficult question, can the votes that he's brought together and the organisation that he's put together stay together without his shining face at the top? I don't know the answer.
I certainly agree with Harry that tomorrow is not a victory because we either have a right-wing candidate or a far-right candidate. if Macron wins, we'll certainly see his true colours of what he believes in politically, and I think we'll see on the broad side of it very much the same, but we'll see some very cutting policies that do show his character. And if Le Pen wins, well, we're going to be in for a really big surprise in terms of how we in the West think as a society in general. I think she really is going to come in and change French politics. But one thing I always find inspiring about France is the raw, true passion of the leftists. They always really do believe in what they are fighting for and actively fight for it. I saw a fight in the streets 2 days ago between the Communist Party members and some of the Le Pen followers. Like, they really do fight for it, and that's something I always found inspiring about French politics.
So that's a really vivid and exciting in many ways image. But I just want to talk for a second about Le Pen. Now, Le Pen got 23.15% of the vote, which for me, for a far-right candidate, that is huge. That's like nearly a quarter of the people identifying with someone who was Le Front National. I know she's tried to move towards a cleaned up image and things like that, but is that really the case? Are there really that many people who are willing to nail their colours to the mast in this way and say, I'm behind the far right? Or is there something going on with that demographic where it's like there are other reasons to vote for Le Pen? Is it only people who are maybe jingoistic or maybe actually genuinely racist? Or is there something else going on there with Le Pen? And also, if she gets in, what is she going to do? Because I've heard that she's going to support Russia, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I don't know whether that's true or not, but so what's going on with her voter base, and what will she do if she wins?
I think she has quite a varied supporter base, as we've highlighted tonight. That she has some minor support from maybe some left-wing candidates. She's drawing support from the Conservative Party of France, Les Républicains, and she's obviously taken votes back from Zemmour. So she has quite a variety of different candidates. And also, I think the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protests, we haven't mentioned that about. And there may even be people who, as we've said, are frustrated with Macron. And so in terms of what she's going to do after, I think we can certainly expect a lot more tougher policies towards Muslims in France. We'll certainly, concerning Russia, she has said she does not support the invasion and she supports the sanctions. And but she's talking about after the conflict, reapproachment of the West and Russia. We're actively seeking positive relationships with Putin, and you can draw that from that what you want: positive relationships with Putin. And so we would certainly see a tearing up of the policy book from an important Western nation in terms of the current security framework.
Harry, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, in terms of Le Pen's electorate, it's hard for me to know. I'm not in those social media groups. I'm in other ones. So it's certainly when her father was a candidate for the far right, it wasn't just the equivalent of UKIP. It was really the equivalent of the BNP and the British National Front, and registering 15% of the vote. She's consciously and deliberately watered her image to become more of a Nigel Farage UKIP type figure. But many people would say that's just the outer coating. A leopard doesn't change its spots. In terms of her voters, how much are they motivated by raw xenophobia? How much are some of them focusing in on specific policies that are moderately redistributive and not thinking about the whole. And also what I think is very important, whether it's UKIP, whether it's Le Pen, whether it's Trump, a sort of sense of, yeah, I'll give the other lot a kick up the backside. So this sort of, you have fun in doing what you're not supposed to do and in causing a pain in the backside for Macron or whoever it is of the day. And I suspect that's quite strong. If Le Pen wins, on the one hand, it will lead to a change in France and French politics. On the other hand, if she wins, it will be because French politics and France have already changed. Ethnically mixed suburbs of Paris and other cities are already policed very heavily. There are racist police scandals on a very frequent nature in France, which are very shocking. The so-called centrist parties use every dog whistle they can find because they think that's what they've got to do to attract a few votes away from Marine Le Pen. So, and when you compare to the UK, you could say, okay, if the equivalent of Le Pen is UKIP, UKIP has never had 23% of the vote nationally. That's not true. I think they did in European elections. But, the Conservatives did capture that vote. And in fact, the European elections are instructive because in the 2019 elections, the Conservatives had a tiny vote and the Lib Dems and the Brexit Party shot up. Then all those votes went straight back to the Conservative Party. So in the UK, our two-party system does hide both the diversity and the extremity of views among the electorate. I think when Le Pen comes in, it will both be certain things she wants to do will be much easier than we'd like to think, because France, like many democracies, has already moved so far to the right. On the other hand, I think she's so hung up on the idea of trying to look respectable, some of the other things will take a longer institutional wrangling. I think we'll be fighting the same struggles with Macron, but with a slightly more smiley face and perhaps a slightly slower pace if we're lucky. But yes, there's little room for optimism other than looking at the parliamentary elections and hoping the left can stay together and continue to build.
But it's interesting, you picked up on the third round, the parliamentary vote. I think that will be a decider as well, because in France, they have a very big history of presidents being elected from one party and then the biggest party in their parliament being from a different party. So the prime minister is often chosen from the biggest parliamentary party, such as Mitterrand, who was a socialist, who then had to work with Jacques Chirac, who was considered right wing of the 80s. So we may even see in the third round one candidate being witted in the parliamentary elections, and their own party not actually being that big.
So that brings in a question from Jacqueline Hemmings, who said, how much power does the French president have in French domestic policy? Is the French president like the US presidency, where the executive branch is the weakest when it comes to domestic policy?
No, the French president is one of the strongest heads of state in sort of constitutional parliamentary democracy. So the French president has the power to propose laws, name the prime minister, conduct foreign policy. And significantly, the French president has the power to dissolve the parliament. So it's an extremely powerful constitutional figure. And it's balanced only really by the powers of the EU, and which I would view as a problem rather than a benefit, but we can discuss that in a second. In terms of the parliamentary vote, what Stanley says is true. There has been a history of a president from the left, a parliament, and a prime minister to the right, and vice versa. But when that happened in the 80s and 90s, you voted for the president every 7 years and the parliament every 5 years, meaning that these votes would take place at different times. So you had a sort of midterm effect. If people were dissatisfied with the president, they'd vote another way for the parliament. Since the early 2000s, both are now every 5 years, and both are held, the parliament's held right after the election, the presidential election, the result being that the result of the presidential election is replicated in the parliament because it reflects what people already think. But also big business sit down with the newly elected president and say, okay, you give us a policy, we'll give you some money for your election campaign. So the result has been that the parliament is no longer a balancing force against the president. It's instead becomes a sort of form of supermajority, that whoever wins the president then wins the parliament to a very great extent. And there's very little counterbalance. That's what happened in the last 5 years with Macron. I hope it doesn't happen this time. But with my perspectivist hat on, I'm a bit of a pessimist, unfortunately.
Um, I would say the French have never gotten over beheading their king. Like the you could describe the presidency now as a royal presidency. He has that much power, and so as Harry mentioned, he has the power to do a lot more than the U.S. president can. But he is certainly a very royal president, and Macron has really even taken that steps further, having his first speech in the Palace of Versailles with all the gold behind him.
I didn't know about that. I'm going to come back to the EU in a second. With it, we'll finish off with that, but I just want to take another couple of questions as well. Jane Strange said, when Marie Le Pen says she wants to ban Muslim dress because women have been forced to wear it, not because she has an issue with Islam, do you think she genuinely believes that?
Difficult question. I think a lot of the French left definitely swallow that line, the so-called left swallow that line that, they're helping Muslims or it's about neutrality. I don't know, like the personal psychology of Le Pen, I think she's got a very xenophobic background. You can be xenophobic and then look at Arab women and only see her as an oppressed subject. But I think also she's so focused on what she needs to do to get elected, and like this constantly reoccurring issue of the headscarf. Politicians on all sides obsess about it because they think, you do that and your votes will go up 5%. I hope they're wrong.
Well, I had this conversation with an Iranian friend of mine. She wears the hijab, and we had this discussion, and she just said basically it's like Western arrogance. Like we think the women who wear hijabs are oppressed, but she says a lot of women feel very frustrated that they do wear it out of choice. Like they believe in Islam and they choose to wear it. And so, no.
It's also had the opposite effect that when it was banned in schools in France, a lot of students from Muslim families or Muslim backgrounds would systematically, the second they were at the school gate leaving school, put their headscarf back on to make the point of, I do what I want, I wear this. So it encouraged headscarf use as a more positive choice than it otherwise would have among some individuals.
Yeah. I work in two schools at the moment. One's a countryside, white middle class ish. There are some people from different communities of France in the village, but also one is in the city. And I would say a majority of the students would wear, female students would wear their religious clothing if they could in schools, but none of them in the schools do.
Can I ask out of curiosity, Stanley, how is it enforced that, if a student came into your class with the headscarf, who stops her and who tells her to take it off?
Well, from a young age, they are taught the rights of man and the separation of church and state. It's like, it's on the walls, you learn it. Like how in America they have to pledge allegiance to the flag, in France they learn the rights of man. And so it's very indoctrinated from a young age. But also, I believe there's like a systems of coercion and punishment depending on how many times people. But from what I've seen, generally, most of the, if not all, follow the rule of no headscarves in the school.
But then want to wear headscarves when they leave school, which is very instructive in that this is not a policy about stopping the repression of women. In fact, it's another aspect of repression for women who are not allowed to choose what they wear. Oh dear me! We should have had a woman on this part of the show, most certainly. But we do that pretty well. Laura always makes sure we do this pretty well, and maybe that's for another show. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to talk about the EU, and then we're going to finish up. So, Mark has said, is there, and I think, I can't find it here, but is there someone to take the French left forward after Mélenchon? Who would be the figure that you would expect people to get behind, maybe?
I mean, I know a few potential candidates. My preference would be Clémentine Autain for any political anoraks who are interested. I guess it's a question from within the French left, but also like for this really, really to work, it's got to survive as something more than just its figurehead. Like the Labour Party, if Keir Starmer gets run over by a bus, and may God forbid that never happen, we only defeat him politically. The Labour Party still exists, beyond the figurehead. Whereas it's not clear that the electoral machine behind Mélenchon, it's got lots of activists, but it's not clear that it's sort of electoral support without his very fiery style of communicating at the television lives. I mean, I'm more optimistic about this, but the actual proof of the pudding hasn't come yet. So I think there are candidates there. On the other hand, the risk is, okay, if someone slightly less fiery than him comes up, do people stop paying attention? Conversely, we should be more than just a leader. So we'll see.
I think Harry knows more about individual candidates or individual politicians of the left in France, but my contribution can be I heard some interesting things about the new anti-capitalist party leader, Philippe Poutou. He's a factory worker, his past trade, and he got elected as the leader of the NPA. And he apparently a lot of people shy away from him because he's very timid. He's not very outspoken. But when he come onto the TV, when he did the TV debates, I think it was the 2017 election, his polls jumped up. And well, and obviously not from like 2 to 20.
1% of the vote. He did.
But I think he could be a potential candidate, but I really don't know any others.
Okay, so that one's a bit wide open then. Okay, so let's talk EU for the last few minutes. So let's talk about EU. Like, regardless of what happens, there will be interesting questions around France's relationship with the EU. I know that Macron has been publicly very supportive of it, but he appears to be someone who is a bit of a will go with the breeze, perhaps, will when it comes to certain issues. So, and Le Pen, I take it Le Pen doesn't want to be anywhere near the EU, is that right? So tell me about this, both of you.
She's changed her position quite recently. Before, it was about Frexit, France leaving the European Union based on Brexit. And I remember last summer during some elections, there was posters all over suburbs of Toulouse, where I was living at the time. And Frexit, Frexit, Frexit. But I've read since she's changed her opinion and she wants to be reformed from within, and she's not so anti-European Union, and as opposed to she wants to reform it. But to reform it to what? There's a quote, she wants to turn it into the Union of Nations, that it's not just the European Union, it is nations in the European Union. And so she really wants to bring in this sovereignism to the EU. Whereas, it's been going more central. She wants to make it more individual again and broken up based on states.
Yeah, Harry.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how in lots of countries, including famously the UK, the EU's become sort of somewhere where people project all sorts of other political dissatisfactions, and notably this idea that, we're told that in politics we can't do a range of things because a sort of certain common sense, a sort of technical view in the world, a certain expert language trumps that, which I do think is actually how the EU works. So it's surprising how little policy detail filtered through to the UK debate. I don't think Macron is going to take a soft or hard Eurosceptic line. I think the EU is too fundamental to his world vision. not to mention his political project. Le Pen, I'm really surprised quite how much she's put water in her wine, having once advocated a referendum on leaving the euro, to now not advocating that. I think with the view that it scared off voters. And I think once she's elected, she might still take the view that in order to keep the peace, this is what she has to do. And I do think actually there's no point leaving the EU for the sake of it. Stay in the EU and do what the hell you like, just like the Germans do, and then leave it for the other members to figure out what they're going to do about it. Now, the real policy issue for France that we don't and did not have in the UK is not the EU in general, it is the euro and the fact that France cannot have a monetary or commercial policy. I equivocated for a long time on this, and I now wonder why I ever did. Why would you get rid of your monetary policy? And so I think that has been something where economic policy in France, like lots of countries in the Eurozone, has been blocked by virtue of the fact that they don't control their own money that they use. And whether that's acknowledged or not, there's sort of a limit to the scope of economic policy that any president can do. So I think that's something structural in the French economy and the Eurozone that sort of breeds resentment for the EU, but paradoxically, resentment for the EU and Brussels more than the euro itself, because it's quite terrifying to abandon your currency. Perhaps not going into the EU because it felt very coordinated and multilateral, but even if you support something in theory, it would be a scary thing to leave the euro. But on a purely technical policy level, I do think it's necessary. And at some point in the next 10 years, I do think it will happen.
What, Brexit?
Leaving the breakup of the Eurozone.
Okay.
Yeah, and establish the franc again as a currency.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways you could go about it. Either each country does its own national currency, or you could have a fork in the euro. So you could have like a Mediterranean euro and a Germanic euro, and then countries align with either one or the other. I could go into boring technical details of how I think it would work. Each note has a barcode, and the first letter of the barcode tells you what country it was issued in. So if you had to overnight switch currency, that's how you'd figure out, man, is this a French euro or German euro or what? But I think the technical cases for staying in the euro are going to get weaker and weaker. I think when the first Eurozone crisis happened after the global financial crisis, for a lot of technocrats and politicians, it was unthinkable to leave the euro. I think now that that's happened once, a lot of people have imagined it in their worst crisis. So when there's another crisis, it will appear a lot less unthinkable. And in particular, as countries adjust to the deficits that they acquired to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's the same division between big surplus countries in the north, more deficit countries in the south, and Euro and EU rules force countries to reduce their deficits as much as possible. So I think at some point, people who are junior finance ministers now will become finance ministers and cut their losses.
Okay, that's a big call. So the final big call, I'm going to ask you to make a prediction, what you think's going to happen tomorrow, and then we'll have to call it an evening because we're a little bit over time. But so Stanley, what do you think's going to happen tomorrow?
I think it's going to be tight, but I think I do not know who's going to win. I think I'm sort of blurred by my want to stay in France. So I sort of hope Macron wins in a way. It feels horrible saying that, but I do. So I think my own view is a bit distorted. So I do hope Macron wins, but I do think it's going to be close.
Do you get a vote, by the way?
No. So before Brexit, it was EU nationals could vote in municipal elections, so mayors and councils. But under Brexit, we're no longer EU nationals, and I don't get to vote in presidential, parliamentary, mayors, nothing.
Okay, all right.
So I've been asking people to vote for myself in the election.
Okay, well, hopefully you won't be ejected from your country of residence. That would be an awful thing. So I hope things work out for you there. Harry, what do you think's going to happen?
So as Stanley said earlier, the polls put Macron, 55% in a straight runoff, maybe slightly more. And the margin of error would really have to be way out for that to tip to a Le Pen victory. That said, I think lots of people are just going to not bother going to the polling stations. They're going to say, I'll let someone else decide. So I suspect it's going to be very knife edge when the exit polls come. And a lot of people will be up late, and the markets might do a little bit of a sort of small roller coaster off the back of that. Um, as I say, the polls show that Macron should get it. He's got a lot of support from old voters who are large in number and tend to turn out. So I reckon he'll hang on. But the fact that the far right has made it to the runoff for the third time now in the 21st century in France, and each time increased significantly their share of the vote, I think that's going to have implications, especially when we look at a geographic map of the result and we can say, okay, Macron won nationally, narrowly, maybe, but look, in this place, in this place, in this place, in this region, the far right came ahead. And it's not over till it's over, and that requires the parliamentary elections in June.
Is there any chance the pollsters have got it wrong and we'll see something very similar to what we had in when Trump won the election?
I mean, basically, yes. I mean, it's so something that's important to know about polls is, obviously they ring people up and say, how are you going to vote? But then not everyone actually goes out and vote. So when you factor in turnout, you warp a lot your raw data in a poll. Now, every couple of elections, the pattern of who does and doesn't turn out changes a lot. So polls tend not to stay together. Polling models tend not to work more than a few elections in the future. And what we've seen lately is in lots of countries, the polls getting it wrong, including in France. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if tomorrow, if during the day we hear low turnout, low turnout, low turnout, that benefits Marine Le Pen, because a lot of people who aren't supporters of either haven't bothered going to the polling stations to vote in Macron. And some people are also, I think, will do a kick up the backside vote for Le Pen, because people really don't like Macron now after 5 years of heavy policing, economic austerity. His general mannerism hasn't been good. So, I think a knife edge election. And I think a narrow victory for Le Pen is not totally out of sight either.
Right. Okay. Well, what I'm going to say is, on behalf of Socialist Think Tank, thank you so much for coming on and educating me massively about what's going on in France. You can become a member of Socialist Think Tank if you like. It is free. We do accept donations to help us keep doing our work, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to, because we are socialists and we believe in bringing people together. You don't have to be affiliated with any particular political party or be from any country to do that. We accept people from around the world and from all sorts of political backgrounds. So, but as long as we don't want you if you're far right. I think that should go without saying. So, thank you so much, the audience tonight. Your comments have been absolutely brilliant. As always, we will see you again very, very soon. This week we've got Political Unmuted coming up. The poll should be coming out for that very soon. And we also have next Saturday, we have the filmmaker Dan Draper coming on to talk about his new film, which was filmed in Liverpool Walton constituency Labour Party. So we'll be joined with some of the stars of that show as well. So something a little bit different, like we like to get a little bit artsy every now and then. So that's going to be one of those things there. Thank you very much, everyone, and we hope to see you soon. Take care.
Keep the red flag flying.